Our moderator, who we'll introduce in a few moments, is going to introduce the litigants in the trial. But I just want to say that I think they put more time into this pro bono case than their own clients, or if they put this much time into this case, then these are definitely attorneys you want to have representing you. So either way you want to look at it. So I thought before we actually begin, though, what I do would be, I think it's appropriate, let's take a look at the actual text itself. So in the chairs in front of you, you guys in the front row, Michael, if you could just maybe bring the card over for the front row people or something. Let's take a look at what we're actually is in dispute here in terms of what happened. So if you can open in the Chumash to the book of Numbers, chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20. I always like to first just say, before I give away the page, because Nathan is trying to find it. Okay? Numbers chapter 20. And in our synagogue, we use both the maroon Etzaim Chumash and the blue art scroll Chumash. The maroon one, the Etzaim, is of the conservative movement, and the blue one is from the art scroll. The commentary is a little bit different, and so it shows a pluralistic approach in our congregation that we want to be able to draw from both sources. The Hebrew is the same, the English translations are a little bit different. So it's Numbers chapter 20. In the blue Chumash, it's on page 843. And in the maroon Etzaim Chumash, we're on the we're on page 884. We're actually going to begin with verse 2. Now what precedes verse 2, verse 1, is that Miriam had died. And then here's what our text tells us. Beginning with verse 2. Kol ha'ida mibar tzim v'lo haya mayim la'ida. And the community had no water. And so they assembled against Moses and against Aaron. And the people disputed with Moses. And they said, saying, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Now there they're referring to having died in Egypt. This is, just to set the context here, people are in the wilderness. This is taking place in the Sinai, the wilderness of Sinai. The Torah has been given, and the people are very concerned because now Miriam has died, there's no water, and this happens a number of times, the people grumbling, and this is one of them. And so then they said, verse 4, and why did you bring the Lord's assembly, the Lord's congregation, to this wilderness to die here, we and our beasts? Why did you take us out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Not a place of seed or fig tree or vine or pomegranate. There was no water to drink. And Moses and Aaron with him came away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, fell on their faces, and the Lord's glory appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and here comes the critical part, this is God's instructions, take the staff and assemble the community, you and Aaron your brother, and you shall speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. and I shall bring forth water for them from the rock, and give drink to the community and to its beasts. So Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had charged, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly in front of the rock. And he said to them, "Listen, pray, rebels, shall we bring forth water for you from this rock?" And Moses raised his hand, and he struck the rock with his staff twice, and abundant water came out, and the community with its beasts drank. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Inasmuch as you did not trust me to sanctify me before the eyes of the Israelites, even so you shall not bring this assembly to the land that I have given to them." These then are known as the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites disputed with the Lord, and he was sanctified through them. So that's the whole kit and caboodle, those 10, 11, 12 verses. We have the situation of the people of Israel in the wilderness. We have grumbling about the water, the concern. God telling Moses what to do. Moses doing what he did. I have to be very careful because I don't want to prejudice the jury in any way. If I could just tell you in services yesterday.
Exactly, like yesterday you did.
Yesterday, at the end when I was making announcements, I had to say that we were going to be judging today how did I put it? I said that the sin of Moses, and Moses' defense attorney objected during services. And not only that, but he actually filed a motion for a change of venue.
So we're all going to Har Shalom.
So at any rate, the motion was denied and we're all here. Okay, so that's the section there. Do you have a question?
Did that constitute work on the Sabbath?
No, just talking. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn things over now to one of the newest members of our community, who you may or may not know, and that's Geoffrey Melada. Geoffrey is the new editor of the Washington Jewish Week. We have copies of the Washington Jewish Week outside. If you haven't had a chance to get your copy this week to become a subscriber. Geoffrey, prior to his life as a journalist and coming to our community to serve as the editor-in-chief of the Washington Jewish Week, is a very accomplished attorney on his own, having tried numerous cases. And so when he and I were talking about this, he mentioned that to me, and so I thought, who better to be our judge today? So I'm going to turn things over now to Geoffrey Melada. Please welcome Geoffrey to our
Thank you very much. Now come to order. Thank you. The Circuit Court of Congregation B'nai Tzedek is now in session. Judge Geoffrey Melada presiding. In the case of the people against Moses, a.k.a. Moshe, a.k.a. Moshe Rabbeinu. The people have rested, and now we proceed to closing arguments in this case. I'm sure, having sat through many days of testimony, you recall the litigants in this case, but in case you do not, I'm going to take a moment to reintroduce them to you. For the government, on my left, Nathan Lewin. Mr. Lewin is engaged in trial and appellate litigation in federal and state courts for 45 years. When he was an assistant to the Solicitor General in the Department of Justice, he argued 12 cases before the Supreme Court of the United States and many more successful. Mr. Lewin was law clerk to the Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and to Associate Justice John Harlan of the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. Lewin also served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. His individual clients have included Attorney General Edward Meese III, former President Richard Nixon, John Lennon, as well as national Jewish organizations on religious liberty issues. He received his BA from Yeshiva College and his JD from Harvard Law School, where he was treasurer of the Harvard Law Review. He currently practices with his daughter Eliza in a boutique litigation firm that bears their name, Lewin & Lewin, and teaches a seminar in Supreme Court litigation at Columbia Law School. To my right, on the defense, Abbe Lowell. Mr. Lowell is the head of Chadbourn's litigation department and chair of the firm's white-collar defense, regulatory investigations, and litigation group. He is one of the nation's leading white-collar defense and trial lawyers. He has successfully tried numerous complex civil and criminal cases in courts throughout the United States and has briefed and argued dozens of appeals before federal courts, including the Supreme Court. He has been counsel to the... He's humble. He has been counsel to the House of Representatives twice, most recently when he was Chief Minority Counsel during the impeachment proceedings against President Clinton. His high-profile clients have included Senators Robert Torricelli, John Ensign, and John Edwards, Representatives Gary Condit and Charlie Wilson, government lobbyist Jack Abramoff, and even Sean Puffy P. Diddy Combs. Currently, as reported in Washington Jewish Week, he represents Senator Robert Menendez in what we could call his troubles with the Department of Justice of late. He received both his undergraduate and law degrees from Columbia University. Counsel, would you please enter your names for the record and proceed.
My name is Nathan Lewin, and I was proud to have been elected your local state's attorney for the Circuit Court of B'nai Tzedek just a year ago. I didn't realize at the time the nature of the defendants whom I would have to be prosecuting. And I must say, you've heard over the testimony over these past couple of weeks some very distinguished references and some very great character testimony regarding the defendant in this case, whom I will call the defendant because I don't want to prejudice you simply by calling him Moshe Rabbeinu or Moses. He's the defendant. He's had very distinguished character references, as I say, in testimony. You heard Maimonides testify, for example. Moshe on Moshe, O come Moshe. That may persuade you in some way. You should put that aside. I tell you today, I come before you as a prosecutor, and in the words of that great Roman general, I come to prosecute the defendant, not to praise him and not to bury him. I have to tell you, certainly on the basis of the testimony that you have heard, the defendant is clearly guilty, and I expect you to return a verdict to that effect. Guilty not because, and I think that's what the character witnesses refer to, not because he had criminal intent or because he's a bad person. He's clearly guilty because there was very specifically violations of what one calls, lawyers like to call, malum prohibitum, not malum in se, things that are prohibited by law, even though they are not morally wrong necessarily. That happens all the time. Maybe many of you from this congregation, and I must say, by the way, although my adversary said he was moving for a change of venue, I'm looking around this room. It appears to me that those of you who qualify for jury service could not possibly have truthfully answered that you did not know the lawyer for the defense. But nonetheless, I have to proceed with regard to this case. And malum prohibitum is violation of rules that are set up for society, regardless of whether one is guilty of a moral offense and violated. Some of you may have driven, for example, on what is known as Case Street in downtown Washington. I don't know whether any of you go down to downtown Washington, but on Case Street there's a tunnel at about 21st Street, and there's a sign that says 25 miles per hour. There are many people, I can tell you, who have been fined and found guilty because they've gone 30 miles an hour through that tunnel. They're not morally reprehensible, but they have violated the statute, which limits you to 25 miles per hour. Now, I know my colleague here is probably not familiar with it, but I will give him at this point an indictment in a case called United States versus Steve Rosen, which involved violations of conspiracy to communicate national defense information to persons not entitled to receive it. Now, that was a prosecution that was ordered a number of years ago. That did not involve moral violations. It was a violation of a technical nature. You may have read, for example, or you shouldn't be reading newspapers about this case, you may have read about a man by the name of David Treyas, for example, who committed a violation with regard to classified information. Very distinguished gentleman, head of the CIA, but he was guilty and he pleaded guilty. But let me give you a copy of this document I know you've never seen before. I hate to spring it on you with summation, but nonetheless, it shows Gothel prohibited. What did the defendant do? You've heard the rabbi read the text. And the defendant was, and again, he's a defendant about whom the Talmud says, Ein ha'olam miskayim ela b'shvil Moshe Aaron. The world exists because of Moses. So I acknowledge all that. But nonetheless, the defendant was told in the very clear terms what it is that he was supposed to do. And that was to take his staff, to go to the rock, to speak to the rock. And water would come out, and he would then provide it to the congregation, to the people. The defendant violated this instruction in probably, and there were people who read this instruction very carefully, more than 10 ways. Not only did he not speak, but instead struck the rock. He struck the rock twice. Not only did he lead the people to the water, and the people were not criticized by the instruction. They were not told that they were violating anything. But he said, Shimuna Hamorim, you rebellious ones. He criticized the children of Israel when they were not being criticized for asking for water. It was understood why they were asking for water. What did he do? He criticized them. He attacked them. He was not understanding and sympathetic to their plight when they had no water. His sister Miriam had died. And because his sister Miriam died, the well that provided water for the people in the desert was gone. When they complained about it, compare what this defendant did this time, which was close to the time that the children of Israel came into the Promised Land, and were going to come into the Promised Land, with what he was instructed to do and did soon after they crossed the Red or Reed Sea. At that point, similarly, they didn't have water. The Lord told him, take your staff, strike the stone. The people at that point said, why did you take us out? We want you to take us back to Egypt. The people this time didn't say, we want you to take us back to Egypt. They said, we're going to die in the desert of thirst. The first time, almost 40 years earlier, this defendant did what he was told to do, what the law required him to do, which is he went to the rock, he smote it, and water came out. Followed the instructions and followed the law. This time, he violated it. He was told specifically what to do, and instead of doing that, he did not trust the people. He called them rebellious. He hit the rock twice. He should not have hit the rock. He hit the rock twice. He, instead of speaking, there are some who say what he should have done when the water came out is given the water to the people. That's what the verse says. The verse says that he was told, take the staff, speak to the rock in their presence, and you will thus bring forth water from the cliff, and give the water to the people. He didn't even do that. Instead of giving the water to the people, he hit the rock, the water came out, and he left. Now, he's not a bad man. He's not a bad man. But what does that tell you about his ability to lead a nation? And this leads to the second issue, which you have to consider. The question is, can he lead this nation into the promised land? Compare what this defendant was like 40 years ago, when he led the people out of Egypt and followed instructions precisely the way he was supposed to do, with what he has done now. And you sit here to judge him on that, with what he has done now, when this time he has not followed the instruction, has criticized the people. What's the difference? The difference is generation. 40 years ago, the people came out of Egypt. They had suffered as slaves. He led them out. He followed instructions. He has done remarkable things. This defendant has done remarkable things, and I'm not up here to undermine those. But he was capable of leading that generation 40 years ago. Now, today, what did he do? He did not understand this generation. This is not a generation of people who came out of Egypt as slaves. This is a generation of people who were born and raised in the desert. The Lord said, understand them. They're thirsty. Go and speak to the rock. And if you speak to the rock, people will see that the Lord can bring water out of a rock. Instead of doing that, another violation of his was that he said, can we bring forth water from this rock? The question that he asked the people was not, can the Lord bring water from the rock, but min hasela hazeh notzi lachem, can I, Moshe, the defendant and his brother, bring water from the rock? He does not understand this generation. He is not capable of leading this generation into the promised land. You know, it's almost his 120th birthday. Tzaddikim supposedly are born on a day and die on the very same day of their birthday. And in the future, maybe people will say, you should live as long as this defendant, 120 years. If he does not get this punishment, he's going to live longer than 120 years. He's going to go into the promised land, maybe celebrate his 121st birthday in the promised land. What will people say? Live till 121? Makes no sense at all. I have to say, therefore, that the time has come correctly. So, whether one views it as punishment or however one views it, as saying to this defendant, your time is up. You've outlived your usefulness. You were a great leader for a previous generation. Not a great leader for this generation, and your time is up. And therefore, I ask you to return a verdict both of guilty and a verdict that the punishment is appropriate. Now you may say, well, what use is it our doing this? Accomplished attorney will take an appeal to a higher court and reverse it. I can assure you that the highest court in the world has approved this verdict. In conclusion, I just want to remind you that next year I've announced my candidacy for governor, and I hope you support it.
Thank you, Counsel. Mr. Lowell.
May it please my learned but overly harsh opposing counsel, rabbis, and this honorable congregation, remember I'm a member here, and whoever else might be listening in. I am Some have said, how could that have occurred? Well, the simple answer, given who I've represented in the past, is pretty obvious, isn't it? I clearly needed a new level of client. And as to Moshe, he was heard to say, so new, given what I'm paying, I could do worse. It was a veritable match made in heaven. Or maybe not. Remembering that a sin against God is at least as great an offense as a crime against man, I remind all of you that the prosecutor has the burden of proof, that the standard for guilt has to be at least beyond a reasonable doubt, and that a sin, like a crime, requires a level of knowledge and intentionality. And Mr. Lewin has already provided you one of the age-old distinctions in the law, the later-to-be-known language called Latin, called malum prohibitum versus malum per se. Malum prohibitum means things which are not obviously illegal, but we as a society create them so. Malum per se, that which is obvious as it is illegal in any context. The best example, of course, is murder. You don't need a law that says, you don't need a commandment that says, but even then I shall return to that particular commandment. So I start by reminding you that there's nothing inherently illegal about hitting a rock. So in the time that I have today, I will address three separate arguments as to why Moses is not guilty of any offense whatsoever, and certainly not be subject to the overly severe punishment of being banned from entering the promised land with the people of Israel. There are factual, legal, and fairness reasons for this result. To begin with, the charge against Moses is that he heard the directive from God, which can be found in the record at Bamidbar 28-12. And you remember it says this: take the staff and assemble the congregation and tell the rock before their eyes to yield water. And then, according to the accusations in the case, Moses knowingly and intentionally disobeyed, and instead he struck the rock twice. Ladies and gentlemen, this ignores the entire record of what we know about my client. As Mr. Lewin concludes, this was not the only time that the people were thirsty and whining and complaining. Recall that 39 years earlier, after first leaving Egypt, while at Rephidim, God and Moses spoke about fixing the water problem then. And God specifically told Moses to strike, not talk, to the rock. Again, reference to the record, Exodus 17:6, where God ordered Moses as follows: behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it. So here, at Zin, Moses cannot be blamed if he believed he had gotten the exact same instructions as he had gotten before. First, remember, all of you know that my client has trouble speaking. He has a speaking disorder. What you may not know is that this affliction often comes with a hearing disorder. And you will know that when a person has such a hearing disorder, he often, or she often, associates to fill in the words he does not hear well from his past experiences. In this way, recalling the precise words that Moses were given at Rephidim, consider that Moses actually heard the word strike and not talk. Surely, he can be given the benefit of the doubt for this one fact alone. Okay, compounding the issue, of course, is Moses' age. At the time of this incident, we know he was close to 120 years old. I don't know about you, but I'm half of his age. And I often confuse two conversations I have had with the same person about the same subject. So what do we have here? People complaining about being thirsty, needing water, God's conversing with Moses, telling him to get water from a rock. One time strike, another time talk. People far younger than Moses could get this confused. Someday, people will understand this aging impairment. And they'll understand it better, and they may even give it a name, a fancy name like Alzheimer's. But now, we shortly know 100-year-olds can blend two conversations like this together. And again, under the rules, he deserves the benefit of that doubt. So on the fact issues alone, there's more than enough to find him not guilty because he did not knowingly and intentionally disobey God's order. Turning to the law, if the Torah means anything, one of its core principles is basic fairness. Someday, we may call this due process or equal protection. But for now, let's just call it basic fairness. One part of basic fairness is the necessity for proper notice before somebody can be found guilty of anything. So if God wanted to change the way Moses ought to do something, he needed to give Moses better and longer notice. If it mattered whether you hit a rock, talk to a rock, or like my kid, listen to rock, then not only the change of method, but also the consequences for not following the rules needed to be better spelled out. For 40 or more years, Moses had been a forceful man, a man of action, and especially a man who used his rod for action. He used it to disperse the men at the well of Jethro. He used it to cast down and turn it into snakes in front of Pharaoh. He used it to dip into the Nile to turn the water into blood. He passed it over his head to create darkness and raised it to split the Red Sea. And then he used it to strike the rock of Rephidim. God may have wanted a kinder, gentle Moses, as the people were now about to enter the new land and were far away from the violence of Egypt. But for this man of action, with a 40-year rod habit, a better transition was needed. Or, as the Hebrew expression goes, Atalo yachol med nabi zechen shrikim hadashim. Or, you can't teach an old prophet new tricks. Another component of fairness beyond proper notice is the same treatment under the law. Someday this might be called equal protection, but for now, it just seems to mean what's good for God is good for man. Even God made, or at least questioned, his own actions when they were prompted by wrath and anger and impatience with the people of Israel. Whether it was his regrets after Noah's flood to his lament after the golden calf, God admitted that he acted out of anger. Indeed, the word wrath and anger is found 650 times in the Torah. Of this, 499 are God's wrath, and 450 of those are directed at the people of Israel. That it is possible for God to act hastily, out of anger, becoming exasperated by the lack of faith or disobedience of the people, that it is unfair to hold Moses to a different standard than on the one occasion that he did the same thing. From the time of Cain and Abel, the law recognizes the degree of willfulness of our bad acts. For example, the rule, thou shalt not murder, recognizes differences between premeditation and the lesser offense caused by emotions and the heat of passion. Thus, at worst, like God himself, at times Moses' actions, if they could be deemed to be a sin at all, were loads of passion, not premeditation. And therefore, I offer to you that he is at least not guilty on the grounds of temporary insanity. So on the law as well as the facts, there's no basis for a guilty verdict, and there's more than enough to acquit him. Finally, let me turn to the issue of punishment. Should by some outrageous miscarriage of justice a guilty verdict be found today? There are three principles around which all punishment under the law is determined. Deterring a person from doing wrong again. Rehabilitating a person to lead a more productive life in society. And setting an example to deter others from committing the same wrong. There could hardly be dissent that my client does not need to be deterred from any further wrongdoing. His 100-year history shows him to be a man of great honor, and his short life left means that a future sin is unlikely. Similarly, how many people from Adam and Eve to some future leader that might be named Melada had less of a need to be rehabilitated than Moses? By the word of God himself in Bamidbar 12:3, Moses was, quote, the most humble above all men on the face of the earth. pre-sentence report surely means he needs no rehabilitation. So that leaves sending a message, deterring the acts of others. Consider this. Abbe Lowell says that Moses' guilt and punishment was sealed for his disobedience to God's command. And what havoc it would wreak with the people, who would see that they too could disobey God, that Moses was not found guilty and punished severely. But remember, first, that the people did not hear God's instructions to Moses to talk to the rock instead of striking it. Only Aaron did. And so the people would not know that he should have acted differently than he acted. Indeed, the only time that they knew about, either because some were still alive or what they had heard from their parents, was that Moses had struck the rock to give water to the pass. And what message does it send for deterrence? For God to have also banned Aaron from entering the land. He didn't strike the rock. The message, unless you change it today and mitigate the punishment, is one of guilt by association. Something we all abhor, and for Jews is especially dangerous. And if God wanted to create the proper lesson of obedience, all he had to do was not allow the water to rush forth from the rock until Moses did it right. What better way to demonstrate his power, Moses' lack of power, and the need to obey God's rules than to withhold the water until Moses spoke as he was directed. In yesterday's Torah reading on another form of punishment, a form of banishment for those afflicted with skin ailments, we are reminded the principle for punishment in the Torah is that the punishment is to fit the crime, or the phrase midah k'neged hamidah, or also known as measure for measure. Someday we may call this something like the ban against cruel and unusual punishment. But for now, measure for measure is good enough. And in measuring the punishment, therefore, God ought to do a better thing. For the man who gave up all the comforts of his royal life in the palace to survive in the desert and lead his people out of bondage. For the man who carried out every other directive of God with little doubt and much faith and allegiance to the instructions, not for a day, not for a week, not even for a year, but for more than 80 years. For the man who put up with and helped God himself put up with whining and gripes of the people who had every reason to believe in God, and yet over and over tried both Moses' and God's patience. And for the man, for all he did, had only one wish, to enter the land of milk and honey, promised to the people, with the people, and pass his last days in Eretz Israel. To answer Abbe Lowell's questions to you, there were alternatives to this harsh punishment that would create the same lesson and the same deterrence and be more measure for measure. He could be embarrassed by no water coming out of the rock until he did it right. He could have been required to relinquish his leadership to Joshua earlier than he did. He could be allowed to live just a few hours after he got to the land of Israel, and therefore we wouldn't disturb the 120-year principle and saying. Or he could have had his name omitted from the Haggadah. But for whatever you might find Moses did wrong, surely not an intentional sin, a more fitting, a more lenient, and a more merciful punishment is surely in order than total prohibition. The man whose name means brought forth from the water deserves better than having a little extra water drown his dream. In conclusion, and for all the reasons I've outlined, I ask, because the facts give a defense, because the law provides a defense, and because fairness provides a defense, for the simply just verdict of not guilty, and determining that any punishment be less severe than forbidding his entering of Israel. Mr. Lewin has the burden of proof. He gets the last word. But actually, you get the last word. And when you get the last word and you determine what should be the outcome, I think all of my argument boils down to one phrase that you should consider in your deliberations. Remember this almost biblical admonition: spare the rod, spoil the tribe.
Thank you, Counsel. Under the doctrine of primacy and recency, the prosecution, in fact, does have the last word. Counselor.
True to his reputation my adversary has presented a very eloquent but irrelevant Imagine that the defendant went through that tunnel on K Street at 35 miles an hour when the sign said 25 miles an hour. Would a judge, for even an instant, have said, well, you're not guilty because your vision isn't so good and you couldn't see the sign? His claim is basically that the defendant suffers from Alzheimer's, is unable to hear, is unable to speak. The amazing thing is, although he had, as a witness at the trial, a very esteemed doctor, Maimonides, he did not present him as an expert on medical qualifications, and he did not testify that this defendant had any physical disabilities which would entitle him to violate the very clear letter of the law. He wants you to look beyond the letter of the law to maybe what its purpose was. Well, there are and will be justices of the Supreme Court who will say that they look to the language of the law and not to its legislative history or what it may have intended to mean. The letter of the law was violated time and again by this defendant. And he has no substantial defense with regard to his violation of the letter of the law. And whether he did it out of malice or intentionally with an evil intent is totally irrelevant. My colleague has spoken about the rod. Well, I'm not enough of a sports fan to know, but I think I had read that Rod had retired. The question of whether the defendant should have had some other kind of punishment, or should have some other punishment, such as enabling Joshua to lead the people into the land, precisely makes the point. It would not have been possible, and the people would not have accepted Joshua as a leader with this defendant around, given his history of all these years when they came to him with complaints, and he corrected it, and he revised it, and he remedied whatever situation, whatever illnesses they had, and whatever shortcomings they were. It was impossible, it is absolutely impossible to conceive of the people of Israel going into Israel with this defendant simply as a matter of the group that was going in being led by Joshua. Therefore, the only appropriate punishment was to remove him from the scene, to have him fill out his 120 years precisely, be gone on the date on his birthday 120 years later. And that would mean that the people are led into the promised land by Joshua. The importance of the precise letter of the law is emphasized by those of you who are studying the Talmud every day in Daf Yomi, the daily passage of the Talmud. Today's Daf Yomi, as a matter of fact, has a Talmudic instruction in the Mishnah of today's Daf Yomi that what? Masna al mashakosov Torah, to know what? That anybody who tries to impose a condition which is contrary to the instruction of the Torah, the condition is void, invalid, inapplicable. And this defendant did exactly that. The Torah told him what to do, and whether he did it willfully or intentionally, or whether he did it for a good motive, he was trying to impose conditions contrary to the instruction of the Torah. And therefore, I submit to you that the proper verdict in this case has to be a verdict, reluctant as I am, Again, I will be standing before you for election next year, and I don't want you to hold this against me, because I've been forced by the reason of my status as your elected state's attorney to bring this prosecution. Nonetheless, I ask you to return a verdict of guilty and to confirm the fact that this defendant should not be permitted to enter the promised land. Thank you.
Thank you to both attorneys in this case. Just a brief housekeeping measure. We are going to adjourn for a short time so that the jury can deliberate. At this point, my tip staff is handing out an updated verdict slip. You'll note that the slip contains 2 questions. One, to the charge of committing a sin at the Rock. You may deliberate at the break and please vote guilty or not guilty. 2, if you find the defendant guilty, should the punishment be barring him from entry into the promised land. If you vote guilty, you are to proceed to question number 2. If you vote not guilty, the court instructs you to assume arguendo, for the sake of argument, that you had found him guilty so that you can participate in the consideration of question number 2. Thank you. Enjoy. Yes, we have a question from the gallery.
When consequences are imposed, would it be fair to state that one should be aware of the consequences prior to one's actions? Moses, having already been found guilty of committing murder and suffered no consequences, would it be fair to say that though he perhaps willfully disregarded the intent of the instructions, was not previously informed of the dire nature of the consequences?
Okay, as I review the record, there was no motion to admit prior bad acts in this case. So the jury is instructed not to consider that. However, let me point out as another housekeeping matter that there is going to be a Q&A following the vote in this case, and we'd be happy to entertain that question. So enjoy the refreshments, and we'll see you soon.
So please vote. We originally were going to use the colored sheets. We're not using that, so instead we're voting. And
now that the deliberations have begun, let's get the reactions of Rabbi Weinblatt and Rabbi Hankin.
Rabbi Weinblatt, you've listened to the trial and you've heard the closing arguments. What do you think the jury's going to do?
That's a great question. At this point, I was trying to just read the body language of the jury, and there's a lot of bodies and a lot of language, so I really think it can go either way. Gotcha, thank you. So, Rabbi Hankin, you've heard the testimony and you've heard the closing arguments. What are your thoughts on this trial while the jury is deliberating?
Well, it's going to be it's going to be a close case. Both the prosecutor and the defense made compelling cases, and we'll see what the jury decides.
Thank you. Let's see if we can now get the reaction of the prosecution and the defense attorneys and get their take on how they think things went.
Abbe, the jury's about to return. How do you feel the case has gone?
I feel confident if the jury follows the law, which includes the requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt. This record is laden with doubt.
All right, thank you. The jury's about to come back. The jury's about to come back. How do you feel the case has gone?
Well, I think, again, I'm hopeful in terms of my candidacy in the future that we can prevail in this case. Because I would hate to have all that criticism in the press about the fact that I brought this case, but I thought it was essential for the integrity of the law to initiate the prosecution and to see it through. Whatever the jury decides, we'll live with it.
Thank you, sir.
Chance, there were 1 or 2 people who had some questions or comments, so we'll take a quick sweep if there are any questions or comments of our litigants, and then the verdict will be read. Please.
As someone who is elderly, and thank you. As someone who's elderly and also recently lost my voice, I have some sympathy for Moshe Rabbeinu, and I would like to ask Mr. Lowell why he didn't raise the issue of age discrimination. Is it possible that God was making an issue out of hitting the rock rather than speaking to cover up his intention of replacing an older Bashir baby?
There's an opening in my law firm. I hope It's a good argument. There's a couple of arguments that people came up to me about. One of which I had thought of. Not that one. That's more creative than I was. But one of the things that I had thought of too, and others had realized it, is, and the commentators note this, by the way, was, I don't know what you make with this one, but why did God tell, as part of the direction for Moses to bring his rod? Given especially his experience before. I mean, why bring it at all, right? I mean, if you just wanted to talk, then leave your rod at home. But I mean, there's so many, this is so filled.
Well, if Abbe had made that argument, I would have responded with the fact that the Torah specifically says, when it talks about Moses passing away, that he lost none of his abilities, even the day before his 120th birthday. So he was fully, there would be no basis for an age discrimination.
He remains virile to the end. Yes.
At creation, God at the end of each day declared that what he created that day was good. Except the second day when he created the fourth. He never said that it was good. And the Midrash asks, why did God say so? And it answers, because God knew that Moses is going to be punished eventually this order. We have some entrapment.
If Abbe had raised that, he knows that the current Supreme Court is very tough on entrapment law. You have to be persuaded actually to do something which you would not otherwise do. If it was back in the days of Earl Warren's Supreme Court, I think he might have a good entrapment defense. But under the court currently, Berger, Rehnquist, Roberts, there's no chance with an entrapment defense.
And then the other issue is combined with why bring the rod as if he knew that someday, I'm not saying it was good on the water, and knowing that God knows what's going to happen in the future, it does raise what we talk about in this place all the time, which is the issues of predetermination, free will. This one parsha, if you had to teach one parsha that really incorporates all the discussions of what kind of God, what kind of man, who are we, etc., this one's pretty good because of all the things. I mean, this one's so much, right? So much.
By the way, let me just ask you guys a question. Should we do something like this again?
Yeah.
I was speaking a little bit with that about possible other issues. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. Meryl, please.
Yeah, so without prejudging what a verdict is, I'm guessing what troubles most people here is not that we didn't do something that God directed not to do, but the enormity of the punishment of such a wonderful Moshe Rabbeinu to stop him after 40 years of leading his people, stopping him from coming into the promised land.
613 commandments are imposed upon us. We have them, the children of Israel had them in the desert, because they heard them from Moshe, who heard them from God. This is an instruction that God gives directly to Moshe. We're not talking about some second-hand kind of conveying, well, God said to somebody who told Moshe that he should do so and so. Moshe hears an instruction directly from God. That to me is as strong, even though it applies to him only. It's not one of the 613 mitzvot, but it's something that applies directly to him that God instructs him to say. And I guess my argument, which I gave before, is that is certainly as powerful as an order of regulation or statute or ordinance that when you're driving along K Street, it says 35 miles an hour. So Moshe violates what he is told directly by God.
To reverse, not to reverse, but to change roles a second, which is not hard to do. Not because I'm a lawyer, but because maybe because I'm a lawyer. Anyway, so
how do you know that Abbe, when we talked about who was going to take which side, Abbe said to me, well, you have more experience being a prosecutor. The fact is, I had experience being a prosecutor 40 years ago. I've forgotten what that's like.
That's true. So here's a couple of points, Marilyn. First is, it's clear to me that Moses violated the direction of God, right? It's obvious. So then you get it to the next level. So is it a sin? Well, if you assume every commandment, direction, etc. of God, 613 plus 1 now, is of equal value or equal authenticity, then it's a sin, I suppose. And the arguments Diana made one about getting proper notice of the consequences, I alluded to that in my due process point. It's sin. Okay, I can get that. Where we all always coalesce is on the punishment side. But, I was talking, I forgot to whom at the break, but, look, looking at it from the other point of view, you have to decide what the sin is. If the sin is basically creating, and it's not even for him, for the people there, but to make sure that he has planted the seed of lack of faith based on the premise of a religion that's about to start and that needs all the adherence to the commandments, and by having the person who should obey the most not do it. So if Moses doesn't have to do it, why the heck us, 5,775 years later have to do it, then maybe the punishment is not even all that severe. Certainly, look what we're doing today. We are understanding the significance of that sin, in talking about it in terms that certainly is going to attenuate our compass as to our degree of faithfulness. So, it's interesting, isn't it?
That's interesting. Yeah, Mark.
God is always portrayed as a living and loving God. Now, Moses was one of his messengers. He was sort of doing a good job. He had a good, clean record all his life. Now, he served God very well. So God punished him because of that. Now, what kind of a loving God is that he would punish him for a small infraction like that?
I don't understand why everybody is so excited about this fellow, about Moshe Rabbeinu being punished. Think of the fact, the number of people, 600,000 men, old and mature age, left Egypt. Very few of them got into the Promised Land. Why? Because 10 of 12 spies said, don't go into the land. It's very bad. So God says, okay, I'm going to kill off this whole generation. My God, you ought to be more concerned about the people who didn't make it into the Promised Land because of those 10 bad spies than you are about the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't make it into the land.
Well, one more thing though, somebody, and raise your hand, because I'm sorry, I don't remember who made this point at the coffee break. And this is another one that's sort of disturbing. On Yom Kippur, we're told that we need to atone for our sins, and to atone for our sins, that you ask God for forgiveness to the things that we've done against God, and then you have to not let that sit. You have to go and ask those, the people. And who said it was you? It was a great point. Moses asks for forgiveness of God for the sin he committed against against God on more than one occasion and pleads with him to change the penalty. And God does not relent. And that's interesting to me, as I hadn't thought about it before. What is so significant about this offense that this is the offense that creates the punishment that we're all uncomfortable with? I don't know the verdict, but I would imagine, since I already told you my view, that he certainly violated something, that people are going to say, yeah, he violated something. Maybe people will say that's guilty. But I bet, without knowing, that everybody's uncomfortable with the punishment, and the majority, if not more than the majority, will say, no, that's not good. What is it about this sin that's so significant?
So compelling.
So compelling that God would forgive Moses. That's interesting to think about.
We have a number of comments, so let's just try and keep them brief so we can get please, John.
Everyone's thinking about the fairness of the punishment in terms of how wonderful Moshe Rabbeinu was. But I guess in modern parlance, the question would be, or the principle would be that no man is greater than the law. Another thought is perhaps we're looking at punishment through modern eyes in terms of rehabilitation and deterrence. And in fact, if the point of the punishment was to encourage scholarship and discussion, then clearly by our being here today, then that's succeeded.
What I'm going to do is let me get the last couple of comments and then let you guys have a response to that.
Chris, a quick question. Do you think this could have been a setup? He was told to go out, take his rod, and talk to the rock. Well, every time he did the rock before he had water, he had a rebellion on his hands from all his people. He went out with his rod, and he struck it. Why did God give him water? Why didn't he just hold off? I think it was because he didn't want him to go into the promised land. He had an opportunity to keep him out because he was too old and wanted the new generation to go in.
Several years back, the Supreme Court in the King's forfeiture case spoke about tempering justice with mercy. And it seems as though there's been no mercy shown here.
What would make you think God's going to be merciful?
All the discussions have been about the action, but one of the things that hasn't been discussed at all would be what was Moses' motivation for his action?
I know there are people who think stare decisis is so 20th century, but what does the record show previously for people who disobeyed direct commands from God? How were they punished? Can you think of any other instances in the Torah?
Then we've got one last over here.
You guys are both terrific. Both of you guys put a lot of the arguments in modern legal terms, in terms of due process, equal protection. When we think about freedom of speech, we think about speech being more than just words. It could be actions, it could be sign language. Teddy Roosevelt spoke softly and carried a big rod. I wish I had used that one. Is there anything? Sorry. I wish I had used that one. Is there any ambiguity in the Bible or the studies on the word speech, whether it might have been an action using the rod?
So with those, I'll let each of you have a few.
So let me do quick and then pass it on. Using yours first. I tried to address that issue because I don't know that we know his motivation. Just from the record, it feels to me that after 40 years, he was the straw that broke the rod's back, right? I mean, it was like enough whining and complaining, and it was just, it seems to me that it was a crime of passion, a crime of, really, not really deliberate, but he finally had enough. So I don't know, I don't feel like it was very deliberated, but anyway, so that, I don't know that he had a motivation, I just think, and maybe that's one of the sub-lessons, that of all of our motivations or motives, God knows that that's a dangerous one for us, because it's in our moments of passion and our moments of wrath that we commit the worst offenses against each other, perhaps, as opposed to those in which we deliberate, in which case we are more thoughtful and then our cerebrum kicks in. So maybe that's that. And one more thing I would have commented on, although I had alluded to the idea that it feels a little bit like a setup to people, both with what Fred said and what Diana said and about the issue of carrying the rod. It feels that way. And as to the issue of the speech, all Or, I'm sorry, the issue of like, is there a precedent? I don't know, you think of like not following the commandment in Sodom and Gomorrah. We have a precedent about not necessarily what happens to you if you don't follow the directions of God to a letter. But as to the speech issue, I don't know, I hadn't thought about it. It's worthy of thought. Although I think Nat will say, and Nat does a lot more First Amendment stuff than I do, I think. And the law is pretty clear between speech and conduct, and this would be conduct, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, any closing comments, please?
There's no question, I think, that if there were not an instruction, then the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu went and hit the rock could be viewed as speech, just as very other forms of demonstration, flags, even flag burning, things like that could be speech. On the other hand, here the irony is that the command he got was speak, and instead of speaking, he took an action. And therefore, it's very hard for him to defend on the ground that action was a form of speech, when what God told him was, use what is traditionally speech, speak to the rock. And then he goes out, and rather than doing that, he hits it. And according to some commentaries, a couple of drops came out the first time he hit it, and so therefore, the verse says he hit it Pamayim, he hit it a second time. So he was doing more than speech with that. I mean, he was not satisfied with a couple of drops that came out first, and then hit it the second time, and out came a lot more. So I think a speech defense would be very, very difficult to make under these circumstances.
So, having had the arguments, the presentations, as well as the questions, and apropos to your last point, I want to just mention Allison Lewis. Allison, if you just wave to everybody. She commented to me during the break that, apropos to what you're saying, that in fact he did strike it twice. But as we all know in baseball, it's 3 strikes. So I can't comment on that. With that, I'm going to turn things back over to our capable judge, who will be calling for our forward.
Thank you. It's tempting in high-profile cases like this for there to be emotional outbursts in the courtroom when the verdict is read. I assure you, these gentlemen in the back are trained bailiffs who will escort you from the sanctuary if you indulge in an emotional outburst when the verdict is read. That being said, would the jury foreman please rise? Thank you. Would you bring the slip here so I can inspect it? Thank you. Yes, everything seems to be in order here. Will the foreman please read the verdict as to question 1 to the charge of whether the defendant, Moses, a.k.a. Moshe, a.k.a. Moshe Rabbeinu, committed a sin at the rock. Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty as charged.
Counselor, what did I just say? And as to point 2, if you find the defendant guilty, should the punishment be barring him from entry into the promised land? The jury vote yes or no?
No, you should not be barred from the promised land.
It is customary to allow the losing side in a jury trial to individually poll each and every of the jury. And in the interest of time, the court's going to deny that motion. And this case is closed.
Thank you.
You've heard the outcome. Do you think the jury got it right?
That's a great question. I think that the people have spoken, and I think that their jury, it was very interesting because they said he was guilty of the crime, but they were disturbed by the punishment. And in certain respects, I think that's a fascinating take on it. And I do think that people are often recognizing Moses obviously did something he wasn't supposed to do, but by the same token, it seems as if the punishment was a bit excessive. And I think that's what we heard today.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi, you've heard the outcome. How do you feel? Did the jury get it right?
So, as the prosecutor and the defense both made compelling cases, as Mr. Lowell said, he expected this outcome. He expected that they'd find him guilty based on some charge, but that the punishment would be the real question. And it looks like he was right.
Thank you. Mr. Lewin, you have a mixed outcome. How do you feel it went?
Well, I feel I'm glad that the jury determined that the law has to be followed and the instruction has to be followed to the letter. I have a lot of sympathy for the notion that the defendant should have been permitted to go into the land, but I presented what I thought was the best case to sustain a contrary result. You win some and you lose some.
How do you think this is going to affect your campaign for governor?
I'm confident.
I'm voting for him.
I'm confident that I will not be attacked as a result of this verdict. I'm happy with that verdict in that regard.
Great. Thank you. Your Honor, you've heard the trial, you've heard the closing arguments, and you've read the verdict. Do you think the jury got it right in this case? And is there any appealable error?
Well, there haven't been any motions raising any error at this point, but I can tell you that the jury was attentive. No one was sleeping. They considered the evidence very carefully. They were respectful to both litigants, and therefore we must respect their decision.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A moment for the press, the jury foreman.
Yes.
How did the deliberations go?
The deliberations were pretty, people had very strong opinions on things. Very strong opinions. It wasn't a pushover one way or the other. In fact, when the final votes came, it was really questionable who was going to win on certain issues.
How long did it take before you reached a verdict?
It probably took, it was quite a while. I didn't check my watch, but it was a significant amount of time.
And do you think the jury got it right?
Definitely, I think the jury got it right.
Thank you, sir. Well, there you have it. Found guilty, but the jury found that the punishment just didn't fit the crime. We'll leave it now to history and the scholars to debate whether or not this jury got it right.